Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophets Speak. Today we continue our study of the Sefer Iyov, the book of Job. We are up to Perek Lamed Ches, which is chapter 38. We have finished now the conversation that occurred between Iyov and his three friends, and then his fourth friend, Elihu. And we are about to hear from God himself. This is, I do believe, the longest speech in the entire Tanakh that we'll ever hear from God to a prophet. It's not common that we get to hear from God himself, but here we do. At least according to what the writer of the book of Iyov is teaching us what God's response to the big question of theodicy is. And I'm sure we're all sitting at the edge of our seats. The answer to the question of theodicy. The answer to why good people suffer and why bad people sometimes seem to prosper. It's going to take several chapters. It's going to be fascinating, interesting. We will learn a lot, and we will also learn what we will never know. Just as a reminder, the three first friends of Iyov, with slightly different angles each one, but the three first friends basically took the tack that God is just. Therefore, good people will always win it, prosper in the end, will be rewarded. Bad people will always suffer. If we see otherwise, just hang in there, and you'll see soon that it's not the case. Always, bad people in the end will lose. Good people will win. And if you're suffering, it must, and you think you're good, it must be because you're bad and you deserve it. That was their simple way of seeing things. Iyov, on the other hand, said, no, I know that I'm good. I know that I don't deserve the suffering. So therefore, why am I suffering? And he challenged God. Iyov still remained in and with the understanding that there's some sort of transactional relationship between him as a human being and God, right? That, I lived a good life. I deserve to have things good for me. Why am I suffering? So he challenged God. Elihu came, the last friend, and said, yes, God is just. There is justice, but we don't see the justice, right? We just have to take the situation that we're in, learn from it, grow from it, understand that God's greatness is beyond us. We can't understand it. So Elihu was bringing us closer to what God himself is going to say, but of course God himself is going to have a lot more to say. So with that little background, let's begin chapter 38. It's long, so I'm probably going to have to divide it into two, but let's hang in there. And let's read it. Vaya'an Adonai et Iyov min hase'ara vayomar. And God answered Iyov. And it's answered because remember, Iyov kept challenging God. I want to come here. Let me take you to court, right? Let me present my case before you. I'm challenging God. Iyov was challenging him. So God answered him, okay, here I am. Min hase'ara. Literally, a se'ara means a storm, sometimes translated as a tempest. The image of a storm, the image of a hurricane or a tornado or something like that. And most understand this to be comparison to when Elijah the prophet, also went up in a storm to the to heaven, and God appeared to and God appeared like in a storm. I just wanted to say that I don't believe this is really to be understood as a storm in that sense. I think it's more of a psychological storm, a storm of circumstance where Iyov is in a terrible situation, and the friends are arguing back and forth. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of lack of understanding. That's a different kind of a storm. It's an emotional storm. Similar to what we find, we have the same word being used in the book of Kings, in Melachim Bet, 2 Kings, chapter 6, verse 11, Vayiso'er leiv melech Aram, and the heart of the king of Aram, who was confused, like, how are the people of Israel that he was fighting against, how did they always know what I'm up to? His heart was in a storm, so to speak. Or we find in Yeshayahu and Isaiah chapter 54, verse 11, where he called, when the people are suffering, he says, Aniyos so'ara lo nuchama. The impoverished people that are so'ara, they are storm-tossed. but and cannot find consolation. So similarly to Eov, who cannot find consolation, the friends here that their hearts are in some sort of a psychological storm. I think that's the way we have to understand this. So God comes min ha'se'ara vayomar. With that understanding, let's go on to verse 2. Mizeh machshich eitzah b'milin b'lidas. God says to Eov in verse 2, who is this one, right? Who is machshich eitzah, who is literally means darkening eitzah, counsel or wisdom. In other words, there is wisdom, right? But all of you Eov, and all of the people here, but God is addressing Eov directly. You're speaking words b'milin b'lidas without knowledge. If we go back to especially the speech of Elihu, but also the final speeches of Eov, we see a constant reference to a desire for das and bina, knowledge and understanding, right? Of course, Eov, the suffering itself was terrible and awful, but the worst part was no understanding. Why is the question why. We always ask why. If only we understood why, it would be easier to handle, easier to understand. If we can't understand why, it makes it worse. So, I'm going to say it now, but we're going to see during this chapter and during the words of God Himself that that there's das, there's knowledge that we have that we have. There's knowledge that we don't have but we can attain, and then there's knowledge of God which we cannot have, which we cannot access. That's the wisdom that God has that we cannot access. And if we understand those three levels, right? God over here is saying at this point in the chapter, He's saying, you are a darkening counsel, right? In other words, because the words that you're saying are, there is sense, there is knowledge, there is wisdom, there is reason, there is understanding, there is eitzah, there is counsel. But by you speaking and not having this knowledge and not knowing this knowledge, you are, in essence, ruining it. You're darkening it. Literally, that means gird your loins like a man. Now, what does this mean here, like a man? The first image that comes up is, be a man, like an image of strength. But what God is really saying here, and I believe at least, that as a man, you have to gird your loins as a man, and you have to try to understand and learn and study everything that you can. Everything that you can get your handle on. When you're suffering, yes, you should examine. You should think. You should search. You should study the world around you. Study the Torah, the teachings that I teach you. Ve'esh'olcha, and then I will ask you, v'hodi'eni, and then you will tell me what you know. So you can gain a lot of knowledge from that. However, when you do that, you will also recognize that there's a limit to your knowledge. Eifo ha'yisa b'yasti aretz. Where were you when I created the world, when I laid the foundations of the world? In other words, you can understand maybe the foundations of the world, but I was before that. I laid the foundations of the world. You cannot access that. You can access the world that you see, but you cannot access beyond that to where I am, because I laid the foundations of the world. Haged, and then you can say, Im yodata vina, if you have that das, and you have that understanding, if you know the understanding. In other words, go ahead and search, go ahead and learn, go ahead and study. That's important, that's your obligation. And what you're going to realize in the end is that you're going to reach a point beyond which you cannot understand. And then you can tell me if you really know. And you'll see you've reached the point where you cannot know. In other words, you cannot know my wisdom. Misam mimadeha kitedah. Who made the measurements of the world that you should know? In other words, when it says mimadeha, meaning the rules, what we would call today the basic foundation laws of physics. Obviously, at the time this book was written, the laws that were understood to govern the universe were different than the laws that we now know today govern the universe. And I'm sure in 100 years we'll know much more about the laws that govern the universe. But whatever those laws are, right? Who made those laws? That you should know them. In other words, you can know the laws, but I'm the one that made the laws, and you cannot know that you should know me? You cannot know me. Omina ta'ala hakav. Who was the one that dropped a kav as a plumb line that's used in building? Who was the one that established the measurements that encompass the universe that we see? Who was the one that determined that the universe should be as it is? Who was the one, in other words, that made the laws of nature? So you cannot understand me. You can understand the measurements, you can learn the laws of nature, but I was the one that made them. On what were the foundation stones established? In other words, you can see the foundation stones, but what's holding up the foundation stones? What is the energy that keeps, and nowadays we would say, that keeps the planets in place, and we can describe the rules and the laws. But who made those? Omi yara evan pinasa. Who was the one who set down the cornerstone of the universe? We might figure out the Big Bang, but who made the Big Bang? Biran yachad kochvei boker. When all of the morning stars sang together, Vayariu kol b'nei Elohim, and all of the, literally, b'nei Elohim literally means the divine beings, or the sons of God would be an exact translation, but meaning all sons of God here, referring to all of creation, right? Everything that God created sang together, all together at the glorious moment of creation. When all that happened, who was the one that made it happen? Vayasech bidlasayim yam. Who was the one who closed the doors of the sea? Meaning, who set out a place. This is where the sea is. Begicho merechem yetze. When it came flowing out of its womb. In other words, when the waters of the universe came flowing from the sources, wherever water came from at creation, who was the one that said, "This is the place where you will gather"? Besumi anon levusho. When I dressed it up, when I placed the place of waters in the clouds, va'arafel chatulto, and I made its chatul in modern Hebrew is a diaper, like you swaddle a baby. So when I swaddled the water in the dense, dark clouds of rain, right? Who made those laws that says that water should condense into clouds and fall as rain and land in the sea? It was me. I made those laws. When I set my limits and laws for the water and to make for its place. This is an important theme in much of ancient mythology, and we find in Tanakh too this idea that the water has its set place. Why doesn't the water, the waves that flow from the water should overflow the land? There shouldn't be any land. But God set it in its place, made a place for it. And I set up its the posts, in other words, the posts that lock the bar that locks a door with lasayim and its doors that said up to here this is the place for water and beyond that is the place for land. V'omar, and I said ad potavo, you can only come up to here, velotosif, but you can't go farther. Ufo yashis begon galecha, and over here will be the place where the great waves of yours will stop. Right? Who was the one that made those laws? It was me, right? In other words, you can observe the water, you can see the waves, you can determine that water goes up to here and not to there. But who said that water should act in the way that it does? We're going to find a lot of themes about water here because water is an incredible creation. It takes many different forms, and we're going to, it forms in the clouds, it forms in the seas, it comes down as rain. And we'll see soon the idea of ice and floating ice, and we'll get to there soon. It's just an incredible creation. It's an incredible substance from which we can see the wisdom of God. In your days, have you ever commanded the morning? Right? Yidato hashachar mekomo. Have you? It's several ways to understand this yidato, but I'm going to translate it as knowledge. Have you known why the morning has its place? In other words, you can determine what time the sun will come up, right? You will know how, the actions of the sun and the actions of the moon and the stars and when it's going to be light and when it's going to be dark. You can define them, you can observe them. But have you tzivisa? Have you commanded them? Have you made those laws? Do you know fully and understand why the morning is in its place? Why it happens this way? No, you don't. That's not something that you have access to. Le'achos b'chanfos haaretz. In such a way that the morning grasps the corners of the universe, right? and shake out the evil ones from it. Now, there's an interesting understanding. So until now, God hasn't said anything until this verse 13 with referencing the idea, the issue of justice. The main question here is, why do good people suffer sometimes? Why Eov specifically is suffering despite having been a perfect tzaddik, a perfectly righteous person? And why do sometimes evil people suffer? This is the first reference to Rishaim, to evil people. I don't believe this is God answering and saying that the Rishaim will... I know many of the commentaries try to understand this, that ultimately, somehow, the Rishaim will suffer in the end. I don't think, and somehow this is God answering and explaining that ultimately... I think that that's actually the opposite of what's being stated here. But I think because nowhere is there even a reference to justice, the question. God is answering this question by saying, so far at least, right? I have knowledge that you have no access to. Go ahead, study the world, study the morning, study the sunrise, study the rain, learn about the world that's around you. And what you're going to recognize is that the world is the foundation of the world, the ultimate reason for the rules and laws of nature that govern the world around us. That is something that only God has access to. I think this verse is continuing on that, right? And what it means is like this. Hamiyamecha, in other words, if we look at the previous verse, have you ever commanded the morning? In other words, are you the one that establishes this world, such that, le'echoz, and then in verse 13, such that you can grab the corners of the world and shake out the evil people from it? In other words, because you, Eov, are saying and thinking that you want to understand, and that you think that the people that you determine are evil and the people that you determine should suffer, right? You want the laws of nature to be such that evil people would not be tolerated. Evil people would suffer. So therefore, right, have you set up the laws of nature in such a way that you can grab the corners of the earth and shake out all the evil people from it? You can't do that, right? The laws of nature I established for the reasons which you cannot know. And my world does not work that way. When the sun rises, it rises for good people and bad people. Even if the bad people, according to you and your sense of justice, your human, small-minded sense of justice, you think it should not rise for the evil, that's not the way my world works. I established nature in such a way that evil people do not get shaken out. Had you established it, maybe you could have designed the world differently. But that's not the world that I designed. Tishapech kichomer chosam, right? And then it continues. Can you, and I'm continuing on the theme of the way I'm translating this, can you change the natural course of the world like a chomer chosam, like the substance of a seal? A seal meaning like a seal when someone's fate is sealed in a court of law. In other words, can you switch up, tisapech, can you switch up the fate of the world like a seal? Like you think in a human court, you can lay down the law and say, okay, you're going to get punished and you're not. This is just, this is not just. And you can stand and dress things up like you can dress things in clothing, right? In other words, a human being thinks, I can put on this cloak, I can put on that cloak, and I can change things. But it's just clothing, it's just garments. You have no control over how nature works. You can't say, you're not the ones that made the rules of nature, God is saying to the human being, like you think you can do in a court of law. Sure, in the court of human courts, you can attempt to administer justice. But in the court of nature, in the court of the world, the laws of nature work the way I established them, not the way you established them. Such that you think that you can take away the light from evil people, and you can break the strong, the one who strong arms, the one who walks around arrogant with strong arm. In other words, right? Can you do that? No, you can't. Right? You can't take the light away from evil people. I created the world, God says, in such a way the light shines for everyone, and that's just the way it is, right? I made the laws of nature, not you. Havasa ad nivche yam. If we see the continuation of all of this, it's so clear to me that the way I'm reading this is right. Just as we read each verse here, they seem to be pounding down this theme. Are you the one that have you penetrated to the depths of the sea? And here we kind of flip a little bit, because it starts to move towards you are not able to understand why the laws of nature are the way they are. Now God is kind of is moving even closer. He's saying, and you haven't even studied the things which maybe human beings can have access to, right? But in those days, maybe they did not have access to the depths of the sea, but nowadays we do. But the point being is that, have you come to the depths of the sea? Do you know what's at the bottom of the ocean? Even today we don't know. But in other words, these are things you may have some access to. These are things in nature, right? But you don't even know that. Have you walked in the depths of the deep? More than nature, do you have any idea what the gates of death are? Do you have any idea why death happens, when death happens, what happens after death? Have you seen the gates of the shadows of death? You don't understand these things. You don't know these things, right? Even the world around you, you haven't seen all of it. Right? Have you thought about, have you understood? This is again, the shoresh, the root of this word is bina, is understanding. Hagedim yodata kula, tell me if you know it all. So God is challenging Eov. Not only do you not know what's beyond nature, like me, because I established nature, right? You don't even know nature. You don't even know everything about the world itself. Eza haderech yishkan ar, do you know which way the is the light rests? In other words, do you understand how light works, and how darkness works? That you can take light to the place where light belongs. And do you understand the pathways to the house, the residence of the light? Right? Yodata ki oz tivoled. Certainly, you know that it was then that you were born. And the days of your life are many. In other words, this is kind of like a sarcastic. God is saying it sounds like he's saying it sarcastically, right? Right? If you knew all of this stuff, right? I'm sorry. Do you know that this is the time when you will be born? And do you know the many days of your life? In other words, do you have any idea when a child is going to be born? Do you have any idea or understanding of that concept? Do you have any idea of the length of a human life, of your life? These are concepts you cannot understand. Havosa elotzros sholeg. Have you come to the places where snow, again to the theme of water, the place where snow is stored, in other words, how snow is formed in the skies, and how the hail is stored in the skies, and how hail comes from the skies. Have you seen these things? So here God is challenging Eov and saying, you don't even know the natural world around you. You don't even understand the greatness of the natural world around you. How could you even come to try to understand the things that are beyond you? This would be a good point to stop. It's hard because this chapter and the next chapter is kind of a continuous theme, but because it's long, I feel it's the right thing to do to cut it here. We just finished verse 22. When we do Job 38, part B, we'll start from verse 23. Thank you so much for studying this together with me. Looking forward to continuing the book of Eov and many other books through Tanakh because we've been studying together. Have a wonderful day.